My name is Mary. For 15 years I believed my identity was etched into the walls of my home, woven into the dinners I prepared, and anchored to the man I loved. I never imagined that the very sanctuary I built with my own hands would one day become a battlefield where I would have to fight for my soul. Before we walk through the shadows of my journey together, I want to offer my deepest, most humble gratitude to each of you for being here. Your time is a gift, and I am truly honored to share this piece of my heart with you. To those who have already joined our family here at Queen's Revenge, I send you my sincerest blessings. May your lives be touched by an abundance of wealth, and may your homes overflow with a happiness that no betrayal can ever dim. If this story touches your heart or reminds you of your own hidden strength, I invite you to subscribe and stand with us. This channel is a sanctuary for those who have been tested by fire, but refuse to be turned to ash. Remember, no matter how hard the world tries to erase you, you are the architect of your own destiny. A crown is never given, it is reclaimed. This is my story, and it begins on a Tuesday morning I will never forget. The morning began with a deceptive, porcelain stillness. Tuesday had always been a quiet day at Oak Ridge Estate, but today the silence felt heavy, almost sentient, as if the very walls were holding their breath. I sat in the breakfast nook, my fingers curled around a ceramic mug of tea that had long since surrendered its warmth. Outside the bay window, the Indonesian sun filtered through the ancient oaks, casting long skeletal shadows across the manicured lawn. This house, this sprawling sanctuary of limestone and memories, had once been a symphony of laughter and chaotic love. Now it was a mausoleum of what used to be. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a whisper from a ghost, the ghost of the woman I was before Mark tore the world out from under me. I had spent the last several months reclaiming the corners of this home, exorcising the scent of his cologne and the lingering resonance of his lies. It was a fragile sanctuary, built on the wreckage of a 15-year marriage that had collapsed with the suddenness of a sinkhole. I thought I had finally found a rhythm in the solitude, a way to breathe without feeling the constriction of betrayal in my chest. But as I watched a lone leaf spiral toward the driveway, a premonition of coldness settled in the marrow of my bones. The doorbell didn't just ring. It struck. It was a sharp, discordant intrusion that vibrated through the soles of my feet, a physical blow to the morning's artificial peace. My heart, a panicked bird against a ribcage of glass, leaped into overdrive. I hadn't expected anyone. My few remaining friends knew to call first, and the mailman usually arrived at noon. For a moment I considered not answering, letting the silence swallow the noise, but the bell rang again, longer, more insistent, dripping with an entitlement that made my skin crawl. I stood up, my joints feeling brittle. As I walked down the long hallway, past the framed photographs of children who were now away at school, and a life that felt like a movie I'd watched a century ago, the air seemed to thin. I reached the heavy mahogany door, took a shuddering breath and pulled it open. The light was blinding for a second, but as my eyes adjusted, the nightmare took a physical form. Standing on my porch, draped in a designer trench coat that cost more than my first car, was Tiffany. She was younger, polished to a high artificial sheen, with hair the color of expensive champagne and eyes that held the warmth of a glacier. She wasn't alone. Flanking her was a man who looked like he had been carved from the very granite of a courtroom, a man in a charcoal suit with a briefcase that looked like a weapon. Tiffany didn't wait for a greeting. She didn't offer the hollow pleasantries of a woman who had stolen another woman's husband. Instead, she let a slow, predatory smile spread across her face, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, which remained fixed on me with a terrifying clinical hunger. "Good morning, Mary," she said. Her voice was sugary sweet, a sickly coating over the jagged steel of her intent. "I hope we aren't interrupting your morning period." I felt the blood drain from my face, leaving me lightheaded. "Tiffany, what are you doing here? Mark knows he is not allowed on the property without." "Mark isn't here, honey," she interrupted, stepping forward into my personal space, the scent of her cloying, expensive perfume invading my lungs. "I am. And I'm here because I'm tired of waiting for you to realize that you're living in a museum that doesn't belong to you anymore." She gestured vaguely at the man beside her. "This is Mr. Sterling. He's here to ensure that the transition goes smoothly. We've been very patient, Mary. We really have. But Mark and I are ready to start our real life. And this house is the centerpiece of that future." It's what Mark worked for. It's what is rightfully ours. The sheer audacity of her words hit me like a physical slap. My ears began to ring. A high-pitched drone that threatened to drown out the world. This house, the centerpiece of their future? Every tile in the foyer had been chosen by me. Every rosebush in the garden had been planted by my hands while Mark was working late, which I now knew was code for being with her. My children had taken their first steps on these floors. We had carved their heights into the pantry door. This wasn't just real estate. It was the physical manifestation of my life's work, my sacrifice, and my love. You need to leave, I managed to whisper, my voice trembling with a cocktail of terror and incandescent rage. The divorce decree was clear about the occupancy of this home. Tiffany laughed. A sharp tinkling sound that felt like glass shards under my skin. She looked over her shoulder at the lawyer, who remained as impassive as a gargoyle. Oh, Mary, you're still playing by the old rules. Mr. Sterling, would you like to enlighten her? The lawyer stepped forward, clicking his briefcase open with a sound like a gunshot. He pulled out a sheaf of papers, the white pages gleaming cruelly in the sunlight. Mrs. Sterling, the new Mrs. Sterling, is correct, he said, his voice a monotonous, icy drone. We have filed an emergency motion based on the discovery of certain irregularities in the initial asset disclosure. We have reason to believe the deed transfer was never fully executed in your favor, due to a technicality in the holding company's bylaws. As of 3 hours ago, a temporary injunction has been granted. Tiffany leaned in closer, her smile widening until it became a grotesque mask of triumph. She looked past me into the house, her eyes already redecorating, already stripping away my presence. I could see her imagining her own photos on the mantel, her own laughter echoing in the halls where I had wept. It's over, Mary, she hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. The locks will be changed by evening. You can take your clothes, I suppose, though I'd prefer you leave the furniture. It fits the aesthetic I want for the nursery. We're here to claim what's ours. Hand over the keys, Mary. Now. Or we'll have the sheriff do it for us. The world tilted. The oaks seemed to lean in, the shadows stretching to swallow me whole. I felt the familiar weight of helplessness beginning to drag me down. The same crushing despair that had nearly drowned me when I first found their messages. I looked at the keys hanging on the hook just inside the door. The small brass pieces of metal that held the borders of my world together. My hand moved toward them, shaking, my spirit flickering like a candle in a gale. But then a shadow moved behind me. A steady rhythmic click-clack of heels on the hardwood floor. A sound of absolute, unshakable authority. A hand, firm and warm, came to rest on my shoulder, grounding me, pulling me back from the precipice of a breakdown. I think you've said quite enough, Mrs. Miller. A voice rang out. It wasn't my voice. It was a voice like a cello, deep, resonant, and humming with a hidden power. I turned to see Clara, my attorney, standing there. She didn't look like she had been caught off guard by a Tuesday morning surprise. She looked like she had been waiting for this exact moment for a very, very long time. In her hand was a folder, not white and thin like the lawyer's, but thick, blue, and embossed with a seal that made Mr. Sterling's icy gaze flicker for the first time. The war hadn't just begun. It had been anticipated. And as I stepped aside to let Clara face the wolves, I realized that the regular Tuesday I thought I was having was actually the day the tides would finally, violently turn. The word home is a heavy thing. It isn't merely a collection of rafters, joists, and drywall, nor is it defined by the deed sitting in a dusty county office. For me, Oak Ridge Estate was an extension of my very nervous system. As I stood there, paralyzed by the icy declaration that I was now a trespasser in my own life, I felt a phantom pain, as if someone were attempting to amputate a limb without the mercy of anesthesia. The hallway behind me stretched out like a long, dark throat, swallowing the decade and a half I had poured into these foundations. To Tiffany, this was a trophy, a sprawling piece of Georgian architecture that signaled her ascent. To me, it was the only place left on earth where I could still hear the faint, lingering echoes of who I used to be before the world turned cold. I watched Tiffany's eyes wander. They didn't look with love, they dissected. She looked at the crown molding I had spent 3 weeks sanding by hand during our second year of marriage, back when Mark and I were building a future instead of a lie. She looked at the hand-painted silk wallpaper in the foyer, the one I had saved for 2 years, and she curled her lip in a gesture of effortless cruelty. "This will have to go first," she murmured, her voice a sharp contrast to the reverent silence I usually maintained in this space. "It's so dated. It feels like a funeral parlor in here, don't you think, Arthur?" She didn't wait for her lawyer's response. She was already mentally stripping the walls, peeling back the layers of my devotion, as if they were nothing more than unsightly scabs. The audacity of her greed was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure in my lungs. She saw dated patterns. I saw the afternoon I spent on a ladder, 7 months pregnant with my daughter, carefully smoothing out the bubbles in that very silk, humming a lullaby to a belly that felt like a miracle. My sweat was cured into the plaster of this house. My tears, the quiet, lonely ones shed when Mark started working late, were soaked into the floorboards of the master bedroom. How could she stand there, smelling of synthetic vanilla and ambition, and claim ownership of my memories? It felt like a profanation of a grave. My mind drifted, unbidden, to the summer the children were small. I could almost see them now, blurred, golden specters running through the sunlight that pooled on the hardwood. I remembered the day Leo had dragged a heavy toy truck across the oak floor in the dining room, leaving a jagged, deep scar in the wood. Mark had been furious, his face turning a shade of red that hinted at the temper he would eventually unleash on our marriage. But I had knelt down, ran my thumb over the splintered grain and smiled. To me, that scratch was a signature. It was proof of life. It was the messy, beautiful reality of a family growing in real time. Now Tiffany's designer heels clicked sharply over that very spot, a rhythmic metallic sound that felt like nails being driven into a coffin. She didn't see the scratch. She saw a defect to be sanded away, a history to be erased. "You really should have kept up with the maintenance, Mary," Tiffany said, her gaze settling on the small, faint smudge near the light switch, a smudge left by a tiny jam-covered hand years ago that I could never bring myself to scrub away. "It's a bit pathetic living in the past like this. Mark told me you were struggling to let go, but I didn't realize you'd let the place rot along with your dignity." The insult hit me, but it was the word rot that truly stung. I hadn't let it rot. I had kept it alive. I was the one who knew which window rattled when the wind came from the east. I was the one who knew the exact trick to the basement door that kept it from sticking. I was the keeper of this sanctuary's secrets. Mark had checked out of this house emotionally years before he left physically. He saw Oak Ridge as an asset to be leveraged, a backdrop for his ego. And Tiffany? She saw it as a stage. Neither of them understood that a house is a living thing that requires a soul to breathe. Without me, these rooms were just hollow boxes of air and expensive materials. The contrast between us was a chasm that no legal document could ever bridge. She stood there, draped in the spoils of my husband's betrayal, viewing my life through the lens of a fixer-upper. Her greed wasn't just for the property. It was for the erasure of my existence. She wanted to walk through these halls and feel no ghost of me. She wanted to tuck my children into the beds I had bought, under the roofs I had maintained, and pretend she was the architect of their security. It was an evisceration of my motherhood, a theft of the very ground I stood upon to protect my family. I felt the familiar, cold bile of heartbreak rise in my throat, but this time it was laced with something sharper, something that tasted like iron. I looked at Clara, who remained a silent, formidable pillar at my side. Clara didn't look at the wallpaper or the scratches on the floor. She looked at the papers in the opposing lawyer's hand with the focused intensity of a hawk watching a field mouse. She saw the architecture of heartbreak for what it truly was, a crime scene. "Tell me, Mr. Sterling." Clara's voice cut through Tiffany's vapid commentary like a scalpel. "When you filed this emergency motion, did you happen to disclose the existence of the secondary holding agreement dated 4 years ago? Or was that technicality conveniently omitted from your presentation to the judge?" The lawyer Sterling stiffened. The smug, bored expression on his face faltered for a fraction of a second, a hairline fracture in his professional veneer. Tiffany's head snapped toward him, her predatory smile flickering like a dying light bulb. I took a step forward, my legs finally finding their strength. The house seemed to settle around me, the walls leaning in as if to offer their silent support. I wasn't just a woman losing her home. I was the heart of this house, and the heart does not stop beating just because a parasite demands it. Tiffany wanted to talk about dated aesthetics. I wanted to talk about blood, sweat, and the 15 years of truth that were woven into the very insulation of this estate. You think you can just walk in here and paint over me? I said, my voice no longer a whisper, but a low vibrating chord of defiance. You think you can buy the history of this family with a temporary injunction and a new coat of lacquer? You see a house, Tiffany. You see an address. But I am the one who built the sanctuary you're trying to steal. And sanctuaries have a way of rejecting those who don't belong. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. The architecture of heartbreak was shifting. It was becoming something else. Something harder. Something like a fortress. As Clara pulled a fresh set of documents from her folder, papers that smelled of ink and impending doom, I realized that the war wasn't just about the keys in the foyer. It was about the soul of the home, and I was prepared to burn the world down before I let them extinguish mine. The threshold of a house is a sacred boundary, a thin line between the world's chaos and the heart's privacy. As Tiffany shifted her weight, the toe of her designer heel hovering just inches above the polished oak of my foyer, she looked like a conqueror preparing to plant a flag on a ruined continent. Her eyes were wide with a feverish, acquisitive light. Her nostrils flared as if she were already inhaling the victory of my displacement. She was so certain of my fragility, so convinced that I was a hollowed-out shell of a woman, that she didn't even notice the stillness that had settled over me. She saw my silence as surrender. She saw my trembling hands as a white flag. She was wrong. My silence was the indrawn breath before a scream, and my trembling was not from fear, but from the sheer kinetic energy of a trap about to spring. Step aside, Mary, Tiffany commanded, her voice dropping the sugary facade for a tone of jagged, unearned authority. Let's not make this more embarrassing for you than it already is. I'm sure you have a suitcase packed somewhere. Perhaps a motel would suit your current budget. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time I didn't see the woman who had stolen my husband. I saw a small greedy child playing with matches in a house made of paper. I felt a cold, crystalline clarity wash over me. I slowly took a step back, moving into the shadows of the hallway, and as I did, I let my hand drop from the door frame. It was a gesture of invitation, but not for her. I'm not the one who should be embarrassed, Tiffany, I said, my voice steadying into a low, dangerous calm. And you're right. Someone is about to leave this property. But it won't be me. Out of the deep velvet shadows of the foyer, where the light of the morning couldn't quite reach, walked Clara. If I was the bruised heart of this house, Clara was its iron ribcage. She didn't merely walk. She occupied the space, her presence expanding until the air seemed to hum with the weight of her authority. She was dressed in a suit of midnight blue, so sharply tailored it looked like armor, and her silver-streaked hair was pulled back into a knot that suggested a mind that allowed for zero disorder. In her hand she clutched a leather-bound folder, the shield we had spent 6 agonizing months forging in the dark, fueled by Mark's arrogance and my own desperate need for survival. The atmosphere in the doorway shifted instantly. The bullying session, the cruel amateurish taunting of a woman who thought she had won evaporated, replaced by the cold, sterile tension of a legal execution. I watched Tiffany's face. It was a fascinating, grotesque transformation. Her sugary confidence didn't just fade. It curdled, the vibrant pink of her cheeks turning a sickly mottled gray. Her predatory smile didn't drop. It hung there, useless and limp, like a mask whose strings had been cut. Who are you? Tiffany demanded, though her voice lacked its previous bite. She looked at Sterling, her lawyer, seeking the reassurance of his cold, professional gaze, but found only a flicker of recognition and a sudden, sharp intake of breath. I am Clara Vance, my attorney said, her voice a rich, authoritative baritone that seemed to vibrate the very air Tiffany was breathing. And I represent Mary in all matters regarding the Oakridge estate and the dissolution of the Miller marriage. Mr. Sterling, I believe you are familiar with my firm's reputation for thoroughness. Sterling's icy gaze didn't just flicker, it calcified. He recognized the name. He recognized the predator at the door. He adjusted his glasses, his fingers suddenly fumbling with the latch of his briefcase. Mrs. Vance, I wasn't aware Mary had retained counsel of your caliber. We were under the impression she was representing herself pro se in these minor property disputes. A calculated misconception, Clara replied, stepping forward until she stood exactly on the line of the threshold. an impenetrable barrier between the intruders and my sanctuary. Mary has been very diligent. While you and your client were busy celebrating your emergency motions, we were busy excavating the truth. You see, an injunction is only as strong as the evidence used to obtain it. And perjury, Mr. Sterling, is such a messy foundation for a legal career. Tiffany's eyes darted between the two lawyers, her confusion ripening into a visible frantic panic. What is she talking about, Arthur? You said the house was ours. You said Mark signed everything over. I watched as Clara opened the blue folder. She didn't hand over a single sheet. She presented a document with the gravity of a death warrant. This, Clara said, her finger tapping a specific line on the page, is the verified audit of the holding company Mark used to attempt the deed transfer. It appears that while Mark was busy signing things over to you, Tiffany, he neglected to mention that the company itself was under a federal lien due to unpaid corporate taxes. Taxes he diverted from the family's joint accounts without Mary's knowledge. The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the ragged, shallow breathing of the woman who thought she could steal my life. Tiffany's hand, which had been reaching for the door handle, retreated as if the brass had turned white-hot. Furthermore, Clara continued, her voice gaining a lethal edge, we have filed a counter-injunction this morning. Not only is your emergency motion null and void due to fraudulent disclosure, but we are also moving for a full freeze on all assets associated with Mark's new ventures. It seems your real life together is built on a foundation of embezzled marital funds. I looked at Tiffany then. The woman who had sneered at my wallpaper, who had called my home a museum, was now staring at the blue folder as if it were a mirror reflecting her own ruin. Her carefully coiffed hair seemed to lose its luster. Her designer coat looked like a costume that no longer fit. She wasn't a conqueror anymore. She was a trespasser who had just realized the bridge behind her was on fire. This is a mistake, Tiffany stammered, her voice thin and reedy. Mark said he handled everything. He said Mary was too weak to fight back. He said she'd just give up if we pushed hard enough. I stepped out from the shadows then, standing shoulder to shoulder with Clara. I felt the house behind me, the walls, the memories, the architecture of heartbreak, pulse with a new fierce energy. I wasn't the grieving widow of a marriage. I was the architect of my own salvation. Mark always did underestimate the things he couldn't buy, I said, my voice cutting through her panic like a cold wind. He thought he could buy your loyalty, he thought he could buy his way out of a 15-year promise, and he thought he could buy my silence with a few threats and a lawyer. But you see, Tiffany, this house isn't just an asset. It's a fortress. And you're on the wrong side of the walls. Clara didn't blink. She held the folder out towards Sterling, who took it with a hand that visibly shook. You have 10 minutes to vacate the property, Mr. Sterling. After that, I will call the police to report a trespass. And I suggest you tell your client to find a very good criminal defense attorney. Embezzlement is such a vulgar charge, don't you think? Tiffany looked at me one last time, and in her eyes I saw it, the curdled remains of her arrogance, replaced by a cold, hollow terror. She turned on her heel, her designer shoes clicking a frantic, rhythmic retreat down the driveway she had so recently intended to claim. As the door swung shut, the thud of the mahogany against the frame felt like the first note of a song I hadn't heard in years. I leaned against the wood, my eyes closing as a wave of exhaustion and triumph crashed over me. The shield had held. The regular Tuesday was over. But as I looked at Clara, I knew the war was just beginning. We hadn't just defended the home. We had declared a counteroffensive. There is a specific kind of silence that occurs when a lie is stripped naked in the middle of a room. It is a vacuum. A sudden drop in pressure that makes your ears pop and your heart race with the primal knowledge that the ground beneath you is no longer solid. As Clara pulled the first set of documents from her blue folder, that silence descended upon my porch like a shroud. I didn't look at the papers. I knew what they represented. I had spent months in dimly lit offices, tracing the invisible threads of Mark's deceit until my eyes burned and my soul felt like it had been through a shredder. Instead, I focused every ounce of my being on Tiffany's face. I wanted to see the exact moment the glass shattered. I watched her with a clinical, almost detached intensity. Up until this second, she had been a masterpiece of curated arrogance. But as Clara stepped closer, The ironclad certainty that Mark had wrapped around her like a protective cloak began to fray. I saw it first in the micro-expressions she couldn't control. There was a sharp, involuntary twitch at the corner of her upper lip, a tiny rhythmic spasm that betrayed the frantic calculations running through her mind. Her eyes, which had been so wide and predatory just moments ago, suddenly narrowed, darting toward the documents as if they were venomous snakes. This is a certified copy of the bylaws for Apex Horizon Holdings. The entity Mark claimed held the sole title to this estate, Clara said, her voice as cool and sharp as a winter morning. She didn't hand the paper to Tiffany. She held it up like a mirror, forcing the other woman to look at the reflection of her own failure. And this, she continued, pulling a second sheet with a crimson federal seal, is the notice of administrative dissolution. It appears that by trying to shield this house from the divorce proceedings, Mark inadvertently triggered a phantom transfer. He moved the deed into a shell company that legally did not exist at the time of the transaction. I saw the color drain from Tiffany's cheeks in a ghastly, uneven tide. Her fingers, which had been clutching her designer handbag with such possessive force, began to tremble. It was a fine, vibrating tremor that made the gold hardware on her bag rattle. A tiny metallic sound that echoed the collapse of her confidence. She looked at Sterling, her lawyer, her eyes screaming for a lifeline, but Sterling was busy staring at the red seal on Clara's document with the expression of a man who had just realized he was standing on a trapdoor. "The house isn't up for grabs, Tiffany," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears, low, steady, and infused with a terrifying kind of peace. "Because the house never left my name. Mark's transfer was a legal phantom. A ghost. He sold you a dream built on thin air. And you were so blinded by greed that you didn't bother to check the foundation. The power dynamic didn't just shift. It inverted. I felt the invisible weight that had been crushing my chest for the last 12 months. The constant agonizing fear that I would wake up one day with no roof over my children's heads, suddenly vanish. For the first time in a year I breathed. It wasn't just a shallow intake of air. It was a deep, soul-filling expansion that made my ribs ache. The oxygen felt cold and clean, scrubbing the scent of Tiffany's synthetic vanilla from my lungs. Tiffany's sugary composure didn't just crack. It disintegrated. "That's impossible," she hissed, her voice cracking, the polished veneer of the new Mrs. Sterling falling away to reveal the desperate, grasping girl underneath. "Mark said. He said he had the best people. He said he had cleaned the titles. He promised me this house, Mary. He promised me a fresh start." "He promised you a stolen life," I countered, taking a step forward, forcing her to retreat another inch toward the steps. "But you can't build a fresh start on a foundation of theft. You see a house as a prize to be won, a way to prove you've replaced me. But this house knows the difference between a caretaker and a thief." I watched as she looked down at the documents again, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. The ironclad plan Mark had given her, the one he had likely whispered about in the dark of their secret bedroom while I was sleeping in this very house, was full of holes. It wasn't a shield, it was a sieve. Every lie he had told her was a crack in the glass, and Clara was currently shattering the entire pane. "Mr. Sterling," Clara said, her tone devoid of any empathy, "I suggest you take your client and leave before I have the local sheriff serve the trespassing warrant that is currently being drafted in my office. Your emergency motion was based on a deed that is legally null and void. If you attempt to enter this house, you will be doing so as common intruders." Sterling didn't even argue. He was already clicking his briefcase shut, his professional distance regained at the expense of his client's dignity. "We'll be in touch, Mrs. Vance," he muttered, not looking at Tiffany, who was staring at him in betrayal. "I'm sure you will be," Clara replied, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "I look forward to the discovery phase. I have a feeling we're going to find many more phantoms in Mark's closet." Tiffany looked at me one last time. The predatory smile was gone, replaced by a look of such pure, unadulterated loathing that it should have chilled me. But it didn't. Felt like a badge of honor. I had seen the twitch, I had seen the trembling, and I had seen the exact moment she realized she was nothing more than a pawn in a game Mark was losing. As they turned to walk down the driveway, Tiffany stumbling slightly in her heels as she fled the scene of her failed conquest, I leaned against the doorframe and let out a long, slow exhale. The thud of her car door closing in the distance was the most beautiful sound I had heard in years. I looked at Clara, who was calmly filing the papers back into her folder. He really thought he could do it, I whispered, the reality of the victory finally sinking in. He really thought he could just erase me. Mark's greatest weakness has always been his belief that he is the smartest person in the room, Clara said, looking up at me with eyes that held a fierce maternal pride. He forgot that you were the one who kept the room together while he was busy playing king. Now Mary, the air is clear. But don't get too comfortable. We've only just started pulling the thread. When Mark finds out his ghost has been caught, he's going to stop being clever and start being desperate. And a desperate man is a dangerous one. I nodded, my hand resting on the smooth wood of the door. I knew she was right. But for now, as the sun climbed higher over Oakridge Estate and the silence returned to being a peaceful companion rather than a heavy burden, I didn't care about the danger. I had reclaimed the air. I had reclaimed my ground. And as I turned back into the house, I felt the walls themselves seem to relax, welcoming the woman who truly belonged. As the sound of Tiffany's retreating footsteps faded into the distance and the roar of her car engine became a mere hum against the morning air, the silence that rushed back into Oakridge Estate was not the peaceful kind. It was a heavy, sepulchral quiet that settled over the foyer like dust on a forgotten grave. Clara had stepped into the kitchen to make a call, leaving me alone in the vast, hollow throat of the house. I leaned my forehead against the cool mahogany of the closed door, my eyes shut tight, and suddenly, I wasn't in 2026 anymore. I was falling backward through time, tumbling into the wreckage of a life I had once thought was indestructible. The haunting of a house doesn't require a death. It only requires a betrayal. As I stood there, I could almost feel Mark's presence. Not the man who had just sent a mercenary in a designer coat to evict me, but the man he used to be. I could almost hear the phantom echo of his laughter from the living room. The way it used to be rich and grounding, a sound that promised safety. But as I opened my eyes and looked down the long sun-drenched hallway, I realized that the man I had loved was a ghost, and the stranger who had replaced him was someone far more dangerous. Our undoing hadn't been a sudden thunderclap. It was a slow burn, a tectonic shift so subtle that I didn't realize the ground had moved until I was standing over a chasm. It began with the late nights, the just one more meeting, the quarterly audits, the investor dinners that bled into the early hours of the morning. At first, I played the role of the supportive partner, keeping his dinner warm in the oven and leaving a lamp on in the study. I told myself that his ambition was for us, for the children, for the legacy we were building within these very walls. I was the architect of his comfort, the silent engine that kept his world running while he was out conquering his own. But the distance grew with an insidious, creeping coldness. It was in the way he stopped looking at me when he spoke, his eyes always drifting toward his phone or the middle distance, as if I were a piece of furniture he had grown tired of seeing. It was in the way his touch became clinical, then rare, then non-existent. We became two satellites orbiting a dying sun, occupying the same space but light years apart in spirit. I remember sitting across from him at the dining table, this same table that Tiffany had just looked at with such greed, and feeling a visceral cold dread. He was there, his physical form occupying the chair, but the man inside was gone. He had become a silhouette, a hollowed-out version of the person I had promised to grow old with. Then came the day the slow-motion car crash reached its point of impact. It was a Tuesday much like today, a day of unremarkable routines and deceptive stillness. Mark had left his phone on the nightstand while he stepped into the shower. It was an accident, a rare slip-up in his otherwise meticulous deception. I hadn't been looking for anything. I was simply moving his watch when the screen lit up. I can't wait to be in our home away from the noise. I miss your touch already, Em. The words didn't make sense at first. They were too intimate, too casual in their cruelty. The sender was listed only as T. My heart didn't break in that moment. It calcified. I felt a wave of nausea so profound it turned the world gray at the edges. I scrolled, my thumb shaking with a violence I couldn't suppress. There were months of it. Pictures of them in places I had never been. Plans for a future that involved my erasure. They weren't just having an affair. They were designing a life over the blueprint of mine. Mark wasn't just leaving me. He was planning to replace me, to swap me out for a newer model and keep the backdrop of the stage we had built together. The confrontation that followed was a blur of obsidian rage and icy indifference. When I showed him the messages, Mark didn't weep. He didn't beg for forgiveness. He simply sighed, a sound of profound boredom, as if he were finally relieved to stop pretending. The stranger in my bedroom looked at me with a clinical detachment that was more painful than any shout. "It was always going to end this way, Mary," he had said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "You've become static. You're part of the old world. Tiffany is the future. I want a life that feels like it's moving, not one that's stuck in the mud of 15 years of us." The slow burn had reached the oxygen, and the resulting explosion had leveled my soul. In the months that followed, I watched as he systematically attempted to dismantle my identity. He didn't just want a divorce. He wanted a total liquidation of our history. He wanted the house because it was the ultimate trophy of his success. And he wanted Tiffany in it because she was the accessory that matched his new ego. It was a calculated, brutal attempt to erase me from the narrative of my own life, to treat the mother of his children as a squatter in a temple I had helped build with my own blood and tears. Standing in the foyer now, the memory of that betrayal felt like a fresh wound, weeping and raw. I looked at the staircase where I had once sat and cried until I was dehydrated, wondering what I had done to deserve such a clinical execution of my happiness. But as the silence of the house pressed in on me, I realized something vital. The ghost of our marriage was just that, a ghost. It had no power over me unless I gave it residence. Mark had spent years trying to make me feel small, trying to convince me that I was a relic of his past, a technicality to be settled. But as I felt the strength returning to my limbs, I looked at the walls of Oakridge Estate with new eyes. These weren't just walls of stone and wood, they were witnesses. They had seen my devotion, my resilience, and my survival. Mark and Tiffany saw this house as an asset, a cold piece of capital to be traded. But I knew its heartbeat. I knew every flaw and every hidden strength. The man I loved had been replaced by a stranger who wanted to erase me, but in his arrogance, he had forgotten one thing. You cannot erase a woman who has found the beauty in her own wreckage. He had given Tiffany the ironclad plan, but he had given me the motive to become the shield. I pushed myself off the door, my spine straightening with a click that felt like a key turning in a lock. The slow-motion car crash was over. The smoke had cleared, and as I walked toward the kitchen to join Clara, I left the ghost of the marriage standing in the foyer, fading into the shadows where it belonged. The architecture of my life was no longer being defined by Mark's betrayal. It was being rebuilt brick by agonizing brick, by the woman who refused to be a footnote in her own story. Betrayal is rarely a clean break. It is a slow necrotic rot that begins in the dark, damp corners of a life once considered shared. We often imagine the discovery of an affair as a cinematic explosion, a dramatic confrontation involving shattered glass and tearful screams. But for me, the anatomy of Mark's betrayal was a series of quiet, agonizing dissections. It was a forensic study in the erosion of trust, a slow-motion collapse where the ground beneath my feet didn't just shake, it liquefied. Standing in the wake of Tiffany's departure, the silence of Oakridge Estate forced me to look directly into the wound I had spent a year trying to cauterize. I had to admit the most searing truth of all. I had been a willing participant in my own blindness. For months, the signs had been there, whispered in the language of missed anniversaries and the sudden, clinical coldness of his voice. I remembered the first time I smelled her, not as a distinct perfume, but as a jarring synthetic sweetness that clung to the lapel of his suit like a parasite. I had convinced myself it was the scent of a crowded elevator, a client's overzealous greeting, anything but the truth. To accept the truth was to accept that the sun was setting on my life, and I was terrified of the dark. The realizations came like rhythmic pulses of pain. There was the sudden obsessive guarding of his phone, a device that went from being a tool for business to a digital black box, always face down, always encrypted, always just out of my reach. There was the vanity that arrived like a late-season storm, the new gym memberships, the expensive tailored shirts, the way he would linger in front of the mirror with a hollow, hungry look in his eyes that I hadn't seen in a decade. I watched him curate a version of himself that was no longer for me, yet I stood by, offering him water, pressing his shirts, and smoothing the very path he was using to walk away. The physical pain of that realization was visceral. It wasn't just a metaphor. It was a heavy leaden weight that settled in the center of my chest, making every breath feel like I was inhaling crushed glass. I remember sitting at the kitchen island watching him work on his laptop and feeling a sudden violent surge of nausea. It was my body's way of screaming what my mind refused to acknowledge. The man sitting 3 feet away from me was a stranger wearing my husband's skin. He was a hollowed-out vessel, and every ounce of the devotion I had poured into him for 15 years had been drained away to feed someone else. Then came the shame. It was a thick, cloying shroud that followed me into every room of this house. I felt a profound, burning embarrassment for my own naivety. How could I have been the stereotypical clueless wife? I was a woman of intellect, a woman who had helped manage the very accounts he was now using to fund his double life. Yet, I had let him gaslight me into believing my instincts were merely anxiety or postmaternal hormones. Every time I had asked a question and accepted his jagged, defensive lies, I had handed him another stone to build the wall between us. The shame wasn't just that he had cheated. It was that I had allowed him to treat my heart like a doormat while I thanked him for the privilege. I remember one night months before the Tuesday that broke everything. When the children were finally asleep, the house was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Mark was in his study, the door locked. I stood outside that door, my hand hovering over the handle, and I felt the tectonic plates of my reality shift. I didn't need to see a message or a photo. I could feel the presence of another woman in the way the air in our home had turned stale and transactional. In that moment I realized that my marriage wasn't a partnership. It was a crime scene. Mark was the perpetrator, and I was the evidence he was trying to dispose of. The anatomy of his betrayal wasn't just about sex. It was about the systematic deconstruction of my worth. He had spent the last year of our marriage making me feel small, making me feel as though my contributions to our family and his career were incidental to his greatness. He needed to believe I was insignificant so that his departure wouldn't feel like a tragedy, but a necessary evolution. He and Tiffany had sat in restaurants, perhaps even in the shadow of this very house, and discussed my life as if it were a clutter to be cleared away. They had dissected my character, mocked my domesticity, and planned my eviction before they had even shared their first public kiss. But as I stood in the hallway of Oak Ridge Estate today, leaning against the wall where the height charts of my children were etched into the wood, the shame began to transmute. It lost its weight and gained a sharp, lethal edge. The victim that Mark and Tiffany had so carefully constructed, the broken, discarded woman who would slink away into the night, was a legal phantom of their own making. They had mistaken my silence for weakness and my devotion for stupidity. They didn't realize that a woman who has survived the systematic dismantling of her soul is the most dangerous opponent they will ever face. I am no longer the woman who stood outside a locked study door, begging for a crumb of honesty. I am the woman who spent the last 6 months in a cold, calculated fury, working with Clara to map every hidden account and every fraudulent transfer. The anatomy of betrayal had taught me how to perform my own surgery. I had cut out the necrotic parts of my heart, the parts that still wanted to believe in Mark, and replaced them with a cold, unyielding resolve. I looked down at my hands. They were no longer shaking. The ground beneath my feet had finally settled, not into the soft soil of a shared life, but into the hard, unforgiving stone of a fortress. Mark didn't leave a victim behind. He left a witness. And as I turned to look at the foyer, where Tiffany had just stood with her predatory smile, I felt a surge of something that felt remarkably like power. They thought they were stealing a house, but they were actually walking into an ambush. The anatomy of my betrayal was complete, but the anatomy of my justice was only just beginning. The study at Oak Ridge Estate had always been Mark's inner sanctum, a room of dark mahogany and leather-bound books that smelled of expensive tobacco and masculine certainty. It was the room where he built his empire, the place where he spent those long, mysterious hours that I once believed were dedicated to our family's security. Now it had been repurposed into our war room. For 3 weeks Clara and I had lived within these walls, fueled by cold dregs of coffee and a shared, simmering indignation. The desk, once cleared of everything but a single fountain pen and a laptop, was now buried under mountains of bank statements, tax returns, and cryptic wire transfer receipts. To an outsider, it looked like a mess of paper. To me, it was the skeletal remains of a murdered trust. Clara sat across from me, her glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, her eyes reflecting the blue light of a spreadsheet that seemed to stretch into infinity. We were looking for the blood. In financial law, they tell you to follow the money, but in the anatomy of a dying marriage, the money is the blood that has been drained from the heart. Every line of numbers was a heartbeat Mark had stolen. We weren't just looking for assets. We were performing an autopsy on 15 years of us. There, Clara whispered, her voice cutting through the heavy midnight silence of the room. She pointed a pen at a series of recurring withdrawals from our joint brokerage account, small enough to be ignored by a busy wife, but consistent enough to build a mountain over time. They start 18 months ago. Management fees paid to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands called Cerulean Ivy Assets. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Cerulean Ivy. Tiffany's middle name was Ivy. Mark had always been fond of clever little nods, a trait I once found charming and now found pathologically narcissistic. I leaned forward, my eyes blurring as I traced the path of those fees. Thousands upon thousands of dollars, diverted from the children's college funds, from our retirement, from the emergency savings I had meticulously managed. He hadn't just been having an affair. He had been performing a slow, methodical heist on our shared future. The financial infidelity was a jagged, glass-edged realization. It was the discovery that while I was sitting in this very house, worrying about the rising cost of the kids' tuition or the leak in the roof, Mark was busy building a life raft for himself and his mistress using the wood from my own floorboards. He wasn't just leaving. He was ensuring that when he did, I would be left standing in the ruins with nothing but the dust. He had planned my poverty with the same precision he used for his multi-million-dollar mergers. The rage that surged through me wasn't about the currency. It wasn't about the lost zeros or the drained accounts. It was the calculated, subterranean cruelty of the timeline. I looked at one specific transfer date, November 14th. I remembered that day vividly. It was our 14th anniversary. Mark had come home late, claiming a deal had gone sideways. I had spent 3 hours in the kitchen, roasting a duck with a cherry glaze because it was his favorite. I had worn the blue silk dress he liked, and I had waited, lighting and relighting the candles, until the wax had pooled into a puddle on the tablecloth. When he finally arrived looking exhausted, he had kissed my forehead and told me how lucky he was to have a wife so grounded and supportive. According to the paper trail in front of me at 4:15 p.m. that afternoon, while I was basting that duck and humming a song, Mark had authorized a wire transfer of $50,000 to the Cerulean Ivy account. I sat back in the leather chair, the air leaving my lungs in a ragged, hollow whistle. The image of myself in that kitchen, warm, devoted, and utterly oblivious, felt like a taunt. I had been nourishing him, caring for him, and protecting his peace while he was actively dismantling mine. He had looked me in the eye over a glass of wine that night, knowing he had just stolen a piece of my children's future to buy a condo for another woman. He had slept in our bed, his breathing rhythmic and peaceful, while the ink on his betrayal was still wet. He wanted me to be a beggar, Clara, I whispered, my voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. He didn't just want out. He wanted to win by making sure I lost everything. He wanted to see me broken so that he could feel justified in leaving. If I was the crazy, broke ex-wife, then he could be the successful man who finally found happiness. Clara reached across the desk and placed her hand over mine. Her skin was warm, a sharp contrast to the cold arithmetic of the papers. He underestimated your capacity for documentation, Mary. Men like Mark think domesticity makes a woman soft. They don't realize it makes us experts in detail. You kept every receipt, every ledger, and every tax return. He thought he was siphoning water from a well, but he was actually leaving a trail of breadcrumbs. I looked down at the coffee cups, the stained porcelain, and the frantic notes I had scrawled in the margins of the bank statements. The rage was no longer a hot, blinding flash. It had settled into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. This was the moment I stopped being the woman who made the dinner and started being the woman who served the bill. We spent the rest of the night tracing the phantom accounts. We found the offshore holdings, the hidden properties, and the trail of business expenses that were actually Tiffany's jewelry and travel. Mark had been siphoning our life savings into a gilded cage for his new bird, believing I would never have the strength or the sense to look under the rug. He had planned to leave me with a mortgage I couldn't pay and a life I couldn't afford, all while he walked into the sunset with the woman he had bought with my stolen security. He's going to be shocked when he realizes we found the Cayman's account, I said, a dark, sharp smile finally touching my lips. He won't just be shocked, Clara replied, clicking the save button on her laptop with a definitive sound. He'll be legally insolvent. By diverting marital assets into offshore accounts during the pendency of a marriage, he's committed fraud. We aren't just going to get the house, Mary. We're going to get back every cent he tried to bury in the sand. As the first gray light of Wednesday morning began to bleed through the curtains of the study, I didn't feel tired. I felt electrified. The paper trail of deceit had given me the map of the battlefield. Mark had spent years trying to erase me, but in his greed, he had left the one thing that would ensure his own destruction: evidence. I stood up, walked to the window, and watched the sun rise over Oak Ridge Estate. The house was still standing. The trees were still there. And so was I. The woman who made the dinner was gone, and in her place was a woman who was ready to reclaim the feast. If Mark's financial treachery was a map of the battlefield, then Tiffany's past was the toxic soil upon which he had chosen to build his new kingdom. For weeks I had allowed the image of her to haunt the periphery of my vision. A younger, vibrant, bubbly specter who had effortlessly replaced me in the heart of the man I loved. I had looked in the mirror and seen a woman etched with the lines of 15 years of service, comparing myself to the airbrushed perfection of the woman who had stood on my doorstep. But as Clara and I turned our forensic gaze away from the bank statements and toward the personal history of one Tiffany Vance, formerly Tiffany Reed, and before that Tiffany Solis, the airbrushed image began to peel and crack, revealing a portrait of a woman who was less a romantic lead and more a professional parasite. It began with a simple background check, a standard procedure that Clara insisted upon with the cold detachment of a surgeon prepping for an incision. We sat in the study, the hum of the high-speed printer providing a rhythmic soundtrack to the systematic dismantling of a persona. As the pages slid into the tray, warm and smelling of fresh ink, I realized that the bubbly new wife was a carefully constructed mask, a role she had played at least twice before with varying degrees of success and subsequent legal carnage. She isn't just an interloper, Mary, Clara said, her eyes fixed on a public records report from 3 counties over. She's a specialist. Look at this. She slid a document across the mahogany desk, a civil suit from 5 years ago. Tiffany had been the executive assistant to a CEO in the tech sector. The suit wasn't for wrongful termination. It was a quiet, sealed settlement regarding the misappropriation of company funds and a breach of a non-disclosure agreement involving the CEO's private estate. The pattern was unmistakable. She didn't fall in love. She performed an acquisition. I felt a surge of dark, jagged satisfaction that tasted like iron in my mouth. For months, I had carried the weight of my own perceived failures, wondering what magic Tiffany possessed that I had lost. Now I saw the magic for what it was: a sophisticated con. She didn't offer Mark a fresh start. She offered him a mirror for his own narcissism, all while her hand was already deep in his pocket. The realization was a searing tonic to my soul. My enemy wasn't a goddess. She was a liability. She was the very rot she had accused my house of harboring, a beautiful fungus blooming on the decay of Mark's integrity. We dug deeper, our shovels hitting the hard stone of her criminal record. A reckless endangerment charge that had been pleaded down to a misdemeanor, a string of nuisance lawsuits she had filed against previous landlords, and most tellingly, a previous marriage that had ended in a flurry of emergency motions, remarkably similar to the one she had tried to execute on me. She had a playbook. She found men in the throes of a midlife crisis, men with heavy pockets and light moral compasses, and she convinced them that she was the cure for their static lives. Every document we found felt like a nail being driven into the coffin of their happily ever after. I read through a deposition from her previous ex-husband, a man who sounded like a broken, hollowed-out version of the man Mark was becoming. He spoke of hidden cameras, manufactured domestic disputes, and financial coercion. As I absorbed his words, I felt a strange, fleeting pang of empathy for Mark. He thought he was the lion who had found a younger mate. He didn't realize he had invited a viper into his bed. But that empathy was quickly swallowed by a fierce, cold joy. He had traded a partner who would have died for him for a predator who was currently measuring him for a shroud. She's just as flawed as he is, I whispered, the words hanging in the air like a long-awaited verdict. He thinks he's found his future, but he's actually found his karma. They deserve each other, Clara. They are two voids trying to fill themselves with other people's lives. The beauty of this, Mary, Clara replied, her pen circling a line in a credit report that showed Tiffany was currently carrying nearly $80,000 in undisclosed high-interest debt, is that Mark has no idea. He thinks he's the one providing for her, the great benefactor. He doesn't know she's using his offshore funds to pay off the collection agencies that have been hounding her for years. When we present this in court, we aren't just defending your home. We are exposing the fraud that is their entire relationship. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened garden. The trees, once so frightening in their skeletal shadows, now looked like sentinels guarding the truth. I thought of the way Tiffany had sneered at my wallpaper, her voice dripping with the entitlement of a queen. She was a woman built on a foundation of litigious debris, a scavenger who dressed in silk to hide the scars of her own grift. The shame I had felt, the burning embarrassment of being replaced, evaporated, replaced by a crystalline sense of purpose. I wasn't the victim of a romantic tragedy. I was the protagonist of a thriller, and the villains were currently celebrating a victory that didn't exist. Mark and Tiffany were a web of lies that had finally become too heavy to support its own weight. Their happily ever after was a house of cards, and I held the wind in my lungs. I thought about the files in the cabinet, the nails we had collected. There was the misappropriated tech fund, the settled harassment suit, the undisclosed debt, and the trail of broken men left in her wake. Each one was a testament to her true nature. A dark, resonant laugh escaped my throat, a sound I hadn't heard in over a year. It was the sound of a woman who had finally realized that the monster under her bed was actually a pathetic, frightened thing in a costume. Tiffany wanted to steal my home? She was currently in the process of losing her own soul to the same greed that had driven her into Mark's arms. And Mark, in his infinite arrogance, had handed her the keys to his own destruction. Let's keep digging, I said, turning back to the desk, the light of the lamp casting a fierce glow over my face. I want to find every ghost, every lie, and every legal entanglement she's ever tried to bury. I want a library of her sins. Clara nodded, her eyes reflecting the same unyielding light. We were no longer just lawyers and clients. We were two women dismantling a legacy of deceit. The web of lies was unraveling, and as the threads came apart, I felt a sense of liberation that was more intoxicating than any love I had ever known. The war was far from over, but the myth of their perfection was dead. I was no longer fighting a bubbly new wife. I was fighting a professional failure, and for the first time I knew with absolute certainty that she was going to lose. The transition from the shadows of our study to the blinding, merciless glare of the public eye happened with the sudden, violent grace of a dam breaking. For months, our war had been fought in whispers, in the rustle of bank statements, and in the sterile silence of legal filings. But truth, once it gains enough mass, refuses to remain contained. Clara and I had meticulously prepared the explosives, and when the first headline hit the digital editions of the local business journals, the implosion was spectacular. Oak Ridge investment tightened under federal scrutiny for marital asset fraud. The screen screamed. I sat in the kitchen, the very heart of the home Mark tried to steal, and watched as the perfect businessman persona he had spent 2 decades cultivating began to melt away like wax in a furnace. It was a public execution of a reputation, a slow-motion dismantling of the man the community had once revered. Mark had always been the golden boy, the visionary, the philanthropist, the man with the Midas touch. He had built his ego on the pillars of integrity and success, words he used to throw around at dinner parties while I stood by his side, the invisible architect of his social grace. But as the details of the cerulean ivy accounts, the offshore transfers, and the systemic deceptions began to leak, the pillars didn't just crack, they vaporized. The news cycle was relentless. Every hour brought a new revelation. His partners were distancing themselves, his board was calling for an emergency audit, and the Midas touch was revealed to be nothing more than a desperate shell game played with his family's future. I walked into the village later that afternoon. A simple trip for groceries that felt like a walk through a minefield. The atmosphere had shifted. The whispers didn't follow me with pity anymore. They followed me with a terrified, morbid curiosity. I saw the faces of our friends, the women I had hosted for charity luncheons, the men Mark had played golf with. They looked away, their eyes skittering across the pavement, as if the stench of Mark's scandal was contagious. But beneath the social awkwardness, I felt the tremors of a deeper shift. The perfect businessman was gone, replaced by a cautionary tale. The veneer was stripped bare, revealing a man who had been willing to bankrupt his children to satisfy a mistress's greed. The feeling that settled in my gut wasn't the ecstatic joy I had imagined during my darkest nights. I didn't feel like dancing on the ashes of his career. Instead, I felt a heavy, somber sense of justice that tasted like salt and iron. It was bittersweet in a way that hollowed out my chest. Watching his world burn meant watching the destruction of the name I had shared for 15 years. It meant watching the father of my children become a pariah. There is no triumph in seeing the man you once loved revealed as a hollow, fraudulent shell. There is only the grim satisfaction of the truth finally catching up to the lie. It was like watching a beautiful ancient building being demolished. You know it was infested with rot. You know it had to come down for the safety of the neighborhood, but you still feel a pang of sorrow for the memory of the light in its windows. I returned home to find a flurry of messages. Mark's partners were calling me, seeking clarity, perhaps hoping I would provide a shield for the misunderstandings. I deleted them all without a word. For years I had been his shield. I had smoothed over his temper, hidden his lapses in judgment, and presented a unified front to a world that didn't know how fragile he truly was. I had been the keeper of his reputation, the guardian of the myth. To see that myth obliterated was to realize that a part of my own history was being erased as well. I was the widow of a living man, mourning a legacy that had never actually existed. The most visceral realization, however, was the reversal of the hunt. For a year I had been the prey. I had been the one hiding in my own home, jumping at every doorbell, terrified that a legal technicality or a cruel whim would cast me and my children into the street. I had been the one being dissected by Tiffany's sneers and Mark's clinical indifference. But now, as I sat on the porch and watched the evening shadows stretch across the lawn, I realized the roles had flipped with a terrifying finality. Mark and Tiffany were the ones in the crosshairs now. I imagined them in whatever rented luxury they were currently occupying, the air thick with the scent of burning bridges. I could see Mark's face, the arrogance replaced by a frantic, sweating desperation as his phone rang incessantly with calls from lawyers and process servers. I could see Tiffany, her bubbly persona curdling as she realized she hadn't hitched her wagon to a star, but to a falling brick. They were the ones looking over their shoulders. They were the ones whose secrets were being dragged into the light by the very press they had once manipulated. The hunter had finally, irrevocably, become the prey. Clara joined me on the porch, 2 glasses of wine in her hands. She didn't say anything at first, she just watched the sunset with me. The silence between us was different now. It wasn't the silence of the war room, but the silence of the aftermath. The board has officially suspended him, Clara said quietly, the wine dark as blood in her glass. The fraud is too deep to ignore. They're launching a full forensic investigation into every account he touched. They aren't just looking at the divorce assets anymore, Mary. They're looking at everything. I thought I'd feel happier, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. I thought I'd feel like I'd won. You have won, Clara replied, her voice firm. But winning isn't always loud. Sometimes winning is just the sound of the world finally admitting you were right. You're mourning the man you thought he was, Mary. That's allowed. But don't let that sorrow blind you to the fact that he was the one who lit the fire. You just stopped him from burning you with it. I took a sip of the wine, the cold liquid a sharp contrast to the heat of the day's revelations. Oak Ridge Estate stood behind me, silent and stoic. The house didn't care about the headlines or the stock prices. It only cared about the hands that tended it. Mark's perfect businessman image was a ghost, a flickering hologram that had finally lost its power. As the stars began to poke through the velvet sky, I realized that the public execution was necessary. The lie had to die so that I could truly live. The somber weight in my chest wasn't regret. It was the gravity of freedom. I was no longer the wife of a titan. I was the owner of my own soul. and for the first time the hunter knew exactly what it felt like to be found. The sun was dipping below the horizon, bleeding a bruised purple across the sky, when the knock came. It wasn't the sharp, entitled ring of Tiffany's visit, nor was it the rhythmic, authoritative strike of Clara's arrival. It was a heavy, uneven thud, the sound of a hand that had lost its conviction. I stood in the darkened kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only companion to my thoughts, and I knew before I even reached the foyer who was standing on the other side of that mahogany door. The air in the house seemed to grow dense, vibrating with the gravitational pull of a dying star. When I opened the door, the Titan of Oakridge was nowhere to be found. In his place stood a man who looked as though he had been hollowed out from the inside. Mark's charcoal suit, usually pressed to a razor's edge, was rumpled and dull. His silk tie was loosened, hanging like a noose around a neck that seemed too thin for his collar. But it was his face that arrested me. The skin was sallow, etched with the frantic geometry of a man who hadn't slept in 48 hours. His eyes, once bright with the predatory intelligence of a market disruptor, were bloodshot and swimming with a desperate, watery light. He didn't look like a husband or even an enemy. He looked like a ghost haunting the ruins of his own making. "Mary," he whispered. The name, which he had once uttered with such clinical indifference, now sounded like a prayer from a man who had forgotten how to worship. I didn't step back to let him in, nor did I slam the door. I simply stood my ground, a sentinel at the gates of the life I had fought to reclaim. The evening breeze was cooling, carrying the scent of damp earth and late-blooming jasmine, but the space between us remained stifling. "What do you want, Mark?" I asked. My voice was a surprise to me. It wasn't jagged with the rage I had carried for months, nor was it soft with the remnants of my old devotion. It was flat, a sheet of cold glass reflecting his own disintegration. I needed to see you. Away from the lawyers. Away from the noise," he said, his hands fluttering toward me before dropping back to his sides like broken wings. "This has gone too far, Mary. The board, the press. It's a bloodbath. They're tearing apart everything I built. Everything we built." I felt a ghost of a flinch at his use of the word "we." The audacity of it was breathtaking. He was invoking a partnership he had spent a year systematically incinerating. He stepped forward, his voice dropping into that familiar, resonant tone he used to close deals, a vestigial remnant of the man who could charm the world into submission. "We need to use some common sense here," he pleaded, his eyes searching mine for a flicker of the woman who used to hang on his every word. "If this goes to trial, if the fraud charges stick, it won't just be me who goes down. Think of the children, Mary. Do you want Leo and Sophie to see their father's name dragged through the mud? Do you want them to know their inheritance was lost to a legal vendetta? For the sake of the family we were, Mary. Have some mercy. Drop the forensic audit. Let's settle this quietly. For them." The guilt trip was a masterpiece of manipulation, a final desperate roll of the dice. He was using our children as human shields, wrapping his own greed in the tattered flag of fatherhood. A year ago this would have worked. A year ago I would have folded, terrified of the social fallout, desperate to protect the image of our family, even if the reality was a rotting corpse. I would have looked at his broken posture and felt my own heart break in sympathy. I had spent 15 years being the emotional shock absorber for his life, smoothing the edges of his failures so he could remain the perfect businessman. But as I looked into his eyes now, I felt something far more devastating than anger. I felt the ultimate test of my growth, and the result was a chilling, absolute stillness. I searched my soul for a spark of the old love, the worship I had once felt for the man I thought was my anchor. I looked for the resentment, the hot, searing coal of hatred that had kept me awake at night. But they were gone. The pedestal was empty. The fire was out. All that remained was a vast, hollow pity. I pitied the man who thought he could buy a new soul with stolen money. I pitied the man who was so small that he had to try to destroy the mother of his children to feel powerful. He wasn't a titan. He was a beggar at the gate, trying to trade counterfeit coins for a second chance he hadn't earned. "Common sense, Mark," I said, the words falling between us like stones into a well. "Common sense would have been not to move our children's college funds into an offshore account for your mistress. Common sense would have been not to treat your wife of 15 years like a line item you could simply delete. You talk about the children as if you're protecting them, but you're only protecting yourself. You're terrified of the mud because you're the one who crawled into it. Mary, please, he choked out, a single tear escaping his bloodshot eye. It was a perfect performance, timed to the second. I made mistakes. I was lost. Tiffany. She isn't who I thought she was. I was blinded. But I'm still the man you loved. I'm still the father of your kids. Don't do this. Don't destroy me. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs, grounding me to the hardwood of the foyer. I looked at him, and for the first time I didn't see the man who had the power to hurt me. I saw a man who had already destroyed himself. That's the thing, Mark, I said, my voice rising with a quiet, lethal clarity. You didn't just leave me. You didn't just find someone else. You tried to destroy me. You tried to leave me with nothing. No home, no security, no dignity. You planned my poverty while I was still roasting your favorite dinner. You stood in this very house and plotted how to make me a stranger to my own life. I stepped back, the light from the foyer spilling out onto the porch, illuminating the wreckage of his face. The power dynamic had reached its final, absolute conclusion. The static woman he had wanted to erase was the only thing standing between him and the abyss, and I was choosing to step aside. This isn't a vendetta, Mark. And it isn't a lack of mercy, I said, my hand finding the edge of the door. This is simply the harvest of the seeds you planted. You didn't just break a promise. You committed a crime against the heart of this family. And you don't get to use the children to shield yourself from the consequences of your own cruelty. Mary, don't. You didn't just leave me, Mark, I repeated, the words tasting like victory and closure combined. You tried to destroy me. This is the consequence. And for the first time in 15 years, I am not going to catch you when you fall. I closed the door. The thud was soft, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of a world ending. I didn't lock it with a flourish. I simply turned the deadbolt and leaned my back against the wood. I listened to the silence of the foyer, a silence that no longer felt heavy or haunted. On the other side of the door, I heard the faint, staggering sound of his footsteps as he walked away, a man finally realizing that the bridge he had burned was the only way back to himself. I walked into the living room, where the moon was beginning to cast a silver glow over the furniture. I sat down in the dark, my hands resting in my lap. The test was over. The worship was dead. I was no longer the beggar for his affection or the victim of his greed. I was the architect of my own peace, and as the night settled over Oakridge Estate, I realized that pity was the final stage of grief. I was finally irrevocably free. The courtroom was a cathedral of cold marble and indifferent wood, a space where lives were reduced to docket numbers and human tragedies were translated into the sterile language of statutes. The air was thick with the scent of floor wax and the oppressive weight of impending finality. As I sat at the petitioner's table, my hands folded neatly over the blue folder that had become my Bible, I felt a strange, detached calm. Beside me, Clara was a statue of obsidian resolve, her eyes fixed on the judge with a predatory focus. Across the aisle, the atmosphere was different. Mark sat flanked by a new, more aggressive legal team, his Titan persona strapped on like a piece of ill-fitting armor. Tiffany sat behind him, a splash of aggressive crimson in the drab room, her chin tilted at an angle that suggested she still believed the world owed her a throne. The hearing had been a grueling marathon of technicalities, but we had reached the precipice. Mark's lead counsel, a man with a voice like gravel in a blender, stood up for his closing gambit. He didn't look at me. He looked at the judge with a practiced, paternalistic sincerity. "Your Honor," he began, his tone dripping with a manufactured sense of noble sacrifice. "My client, despite the unfortunate public discourse surrounding these proceedings, remains first and foremost a father. He is prepared to make a significant concession to ensure the stability of his family's future. Mr. Miller has established the Oakridge Legacy Trust, a multi-million-dollar fund dedicated solely to the education and lifelong security of his and Mary's children." I felt the familiar, cold needle of his manipulation prick at my skin. I watched Mark as his lawyer continued, laying out the terms of the concession. He was offering to fully vest the trust, ensuring our children would never want for anything, on one solitary condition: I was to relinquish all claims to the Oakridge estate. He framed it as a choice between my material attachment to a house and the foundational security of my children. It was a classic Mark Miller move, a sophisticated hostage situation masquerading as an act of grace. He was trying to buy the house with the children's love, betting that my maternal instinct would force me to hand him the keys to the sanctuary he had tried to burn. The house is a burden to Mrs. Miller, the lawyer droned on, a relic of a past that has clearly caused her immense distress. By accepting this trust, she secures the children's legacy while allowing my client to maintain the asset he spent his career building. It is the only common-sense resolution. Mark turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting mine. There was a flicker of the old arrogance there, a glint of the man who believed he could always find the win-win that left everyone else losing. He thought he had me cornered. He thought he had finally found the price of my soul. I looked at Tiffany, and I saw her lips curve into that familiar predatory smile. She thought she was minutes away from picking out new curtains for my bedroom. Then Clara stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The silence that followed her movement was so absolute you could hear the frantic ticking of the court reporter's keys. She didn't look at Mark's lawyers. She pulled a single crimson-sealed document from her folder and walked it toward the bench. "Your Honor," Clara said, her voice a low, resonant thrum of impending doom. "We are well aware of the Oak Ridge Legacy Trust. In fact, we have spent the last 72 hours performing a deep tissue audit of its origins. Mr. Miller speaks of generosity and securing a legacy, but the law has a different name for what has transpired here. We call it fraudulent conveyance and money laundering of marital assets." The judge's eyebrows shot up. Mark's lawyer started to object, but Clara held up a hand, a gesture of such absolute authority that he actually sat back down. "Mr. Miller did not fund this trust with his personal post-separation earnings," Clara continued, her eyes now boring into Mark with the intensity of a laser. "According to the forensic trail, the $3 million used to seed this trust was moved directly from the Cerulean Ivy offshore account, the same account Mr. Miller used to siphon our client's shared life savings during the marriage. He didn't set aside money for his children. He attempted to hide stolen marital property inside a tax-exempt vehicle, believing the sanctity of a children's trust would make it untouchable in a divorce." The air in the courtroom seemed to vanish. I watched the blood drain from Mark's face, leaving him a ghastly translucent gray. The Titan armor didn't just crack. It dissolved. Tiffany's smile vanished, replaced by a look of such hollow, wide-eyed terror that I almost felt a pang of the old pity. Almost. "But here is the shocking twist for Mr. Miller," Clara said, leaning over the table, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper that echoed in every corner of the room. "The trust's own charter, drafted by Mr. Miller's previous counsel to ensure it was ironclad, states that if the funding is found to be sourced from fraudulent activity or contested marital assets, the primary beneficiary's legal guardian, in this case Mary, is automatically appointed as the successor trustee with sole irrevocable power of attorney over the funds. By trying to hide the money from Mary, Mr. Miller accidentally gave her the legal keys to the entire vault." The judge looked down at the documents, then back at Mark. The silence was no longer a vacuum. It was a gavel falling in slow motion. Mark's lawyer was whispering frantically into his ear, but Mark wasn't listening. He was staring at the table, his hands shaking so violently, he had to grip the edge of the wood to keep from falling. "In other words, Your Honor," Clara concluded, turning back to the bench with a flourish of her robes, "the money is already Mary's. The children's future is already secure under her stewardship. Mr. Miller has no bargaining chip. He has only a confession of financial fraud and a trust fund he no longer controls. We ask that the court immediately nullify the concession and award the Oak Ridge estate to the petitioner, as the respondent has demonstrated an utter lack of clean hands in these proceedings." The victory wasn't a shout. It was an exhale. I sat back in my chair, the architecture of heartbreak, finally falling away to reveal a structure of pure, unyielding justice. Mark had tried to use my love for my children as a weapon against me, and in his narcissistic blindness, he had handed me the very sword I needed to end the war. His ace in the hole was the rope he had used to hang his own future. As the judge began to speak, his voice a low rumble of condemnation directed at Mark, I didn't look at my ex-husband. I didn't look at the woman who had tried to steal my life. I looked at my hands, which were perfectly still. The house was mine. The children were safe. And the man who had tried to erase me was now nothing more than a footnote in a case study on the consequences of greed. I realized then that the shocking twist wasn't just the legal technicality. It was the realization that Mark had never truly understood me. He thought I was a victim to be managed, a problem to be solved with a check. He didn't realize that the woman who tucks the children in at night is the same woman who will walk through fire to ensure they never have to fear a man like him again. The bargaining chip was gone. The king was deposed. And as I stood up to leave the courtroom, I felt the heavy, magnificent weight of a life reclaimed. The gavel struck the wood with a finality that seemed to ripple through the very atoms of the room. A singular wooden heartbeat that signaled the death of a lie and the birth of my sovereignty. In that sharp, echoing crack, the 15-year tether that had bound my identity to Mark Miller was severed. The judge's voice, steady and devoid of the theatricality that had defined Mark's defense, filled the chamber with a series of declarations that felt like stones being placed in a foundation. Sole and exclusive ownership of the Oak Ridge estate. Immediate transfer of all contested trust assets. Liability for fraudulent conveyance. Each word was a stitch in the shroud of Mark's ambition, and a brick in the fortress of my future. I sat perfectly still, my spine a column of cool marble, as the legal reality of my victory settled over me like a coronation robe. I didn't turn to look at them immediately. I wanted to savor the internal silence first, the sudden breathtaking absence of the fear that had been my constant shadow. For a year I had carried a phantom weight upon my shoulders, a crushing pressure to prove my worth, to justify my existence in a house I had built with my own soul. Now that weight didn't just lift, it evaporated. I felt a lightness so profound it was almost dizzying, as if the gravity of the world had suddenly decided to be kind to me. I was no longer the discarded wife, or the occupant of a contested asset. I was Mary, the mistress of Oak Ridge, the guardian of the legacy, and the architect of a life that no longer required a man's permission to exist. When I finally turned my gaze toward the other side of the aisle, the sight was a masterclass in the poetry of consequences. Mark didn't look like a titan. He looked like a man who had finally run out of shadows to hide in. He was slumped in his chair, his expensive suit hanging off his frame like the discarded skin of a snake. The arrogance that had once radiated from him like heat was gone, replaced by a hollow, flickering terror. He was facing more than just a divorce settlement. He was facing a federal investigation, professional insolvency, and the absolute ruin of the perfect businessman myth. He looked at his hands, those hands that had signed away our children's security, and I saw them shake with the palsy of a man who realized he had gambled his soul and lost. Beside him, Tiffany was a portrait of curdled ambition. The aggressive crimson of her dress now looked like a wound against the drab courtroom furniture. Her face, once a mask of predatory triumph, was contorted with a mix of fury and disbelief. She wasn't looking at Mark with love or even sympathy. She was looking at him with the cold, calculating eyes of a scavenger who had just realized the carcass was picked clean. She had hitched her wagon to a star, only to find it was a falling brick, and the bubbly persona she had used to infiltrate my life had been replaced by a jagged, desperate bitterness. She had wanted my crown, my home, and my life, but she had failed to realize that a crown is not something you steal. It is something you forge in the fire. As we stood to leave, the silence in the room was heavy and respectful. Mark tried to catch my eye one last time, perhaps for a final plea, a last-ditch effort to invoke the mercy he hadn't earned. But I looked right through him. He was a ghost, a flickering hologram of a past that no longer had the power to haunt me. I walked past them, the rhythmic click of my heels on the marble floor sounding like a countdown to their obsolescence. Outside the courthouse, the air was crisp and carried the scent of rain, a cleansing element for a world that had been through a drought of truth. The drive back to Oak Ridge Estate was a journey through a landscape I was seeing clearly for the first time. I didn't see the trees as obstacles or the gates as a prison. I saw them as sentinels. When I pulled into the driveway, the house didn't look like a building anymore. It looked like a monument to my resilience. It stood tall against the afternoon sun, its limestone glowing with a fierce, quiet pride. Every window was an eye that had witnessed my metamorphosis from a victim of a slow burn to the victor of a legal execution. This wasn't just real estate. It was the physical manifestation of my survival, A sacred space where the floorboards held the rhythm of my children's lives, and the walls held the echoes of my own reclamation. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the heavy mahogany door. The same door where Tiffany had stood with her greedy smile just months ago. I ran my hand over the grain of the wood, feeling the pulse of the house beneath my palm. It felt warm, welcoming, and undeniably mine. I realized then that Mark and Tiffany hadn't just tried to take a house. They had tried to take the very ground I stood upon to protect my family. They had tried to turn my sanctuary into a trophy, unaware that a sanctuary is protected by the spirit of the one who tends it. I entered the foyer, the light spilling across the hardwood floors in long golden ribbons. The silence of the house was no longer hollow. It was full, a resonant peace that filled every corner. I walked through the rooms, touching the dated wallpaper Tiffany had mocked, running my fingers over the scratches on the floor that Mark had wanted to sand away. These weren't defects. They were the scars of a life lived with intensity, proof that love had once resided here and that strength had taken its place. I felt the presence of the woman I was 15 years ago, the hopeful bride, and the woman I was a year ago, the shattered victim, and I reached out to both of them, drawing them into the woman I had become. I walked to the front door and stood on the threshold, looking out at the long winding driveway. In the distance I could almost see the ghosts of Mark and Tiffany fading into the mist of the past, their lies and their greed dissolving into the ether. They were facing legal ruin, social exile, and the agonizing vacuum of their own narcissism. But their fate was no longer my concern. I was no longer the keeper of Mark's reputation or the absorber of his sins. I took a deep, soul-filling breath, the air in Oak Ridge feeling like the purest thing I had ever tasted. I reached for the handle of the door, my hand steady and sure. This was the final act, the ultimate closure. I wasn't just closing the door on the intruders who had tried to steal my peace. I was closing it on the version of me that was ever afraid. I was closing it on the woman who doubted her own worth, the woman who thought she was static, and the woman who believed a man's betrayal could define her. The door swung shut with a soft, authoritative thud that resonated through the entire estate. I turned the deadbolt, the metallic click, sounding like the final note of a symphony. The war was over. The crown was reclaimed. I leaned my back against the wood, a smile finally truly lighting up my face. I was home, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was without anyone else's reflection to tell me. I was Mary, and I was exactly where I belonged. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for spending your precious time with me today. Sharing Mary's journey of reclaiming her soul is a deeply humbling experience, and I am grateful to have you as part of this community. Mary's story reminds us that no matter how hard someone tries to erase your light, your resilience is a flame that cannot be extinguished. If this story touched your heart or gave you strength, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your words might be the exact spark someone else needs to hear today. And if you believe in the power of justice and the beauty of rising from the ashes, I invite you to subscribe to Queen's Revenge. Let's continue to walk this path of strength together. Remember, you are the architect of your own peace.